again, and welcome back to Where Do We Go From Here with Scott Catello. In this episode, we'll be discussing the importance of mentoring. Now, to help me with this particular episode, it seemed most appropriate to ask my longtime mentor in the field of architecture, Mike Kirk. Mike and I both recently discovered that we actually go back to, I think, around 2013-ish, I believe. And Mike's been one of a very select few that has been mentoring me throughout my career in architecture. But enough of me talking about Mike. Mike, please tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Thanks, Scott. Well, I'm an architect. I specialize in historic preservation work and sustainable design. I'm a semi-retired principal from the Newman Smith firm. I've been practicing this for about 49 years. Eventually, I'll get it right. I've worked in many different positions. I've had two of my own firms, ran a couple of other firms, and as I said, just recently retired from Newman Smith. I've had the privilege of working all over the U.S., and for a stint in the 1990s, I did retail design work and actually was with a firm that did work all around the world. So I've had a good run. I've enjoyed it. I actually went to University of Michigan originally to go into pre-law because I was in debate in high school, and changed in my second year into architecture. And I actually still use a lot of that organizational skills from debate in all the work I do. So I always encourage people to get lots of different experiences. I guess that's me, Scott.
Okay. So I tell you all the time, at least recently, you give me hope because you've also taught me that people can retire from this field. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
After 2008, my 401k was a 201k, and I've been able to work back up. But yeah, it's some people have heard the story that architects own $1 million homes and drive Porsches, and unfortunately, that's very far from the truth.
No, it is, because my vehicle is it's a 2010 right now that I'm driving.
Well, I brag because my vehicle is the best vehicle, running vehicle I've ever had. It's a 2010 Ford Escape Hybrid, and it just turned over 299,000 miles.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm trying to preserve the car like I preserve buildings.
Good for you.
Yeah.
So let's get into the whole mentoring topic. And I'm not sure about you, but in my early days of architecture, especially at one of the first quote unquote real firms I worked at, I was assigned a mentor, and that was kind of standard practice at the time. And I didn't really have a choice in who that person was. They kind of just selected that person for me, and that was kind of an old school way of doing it. Now, following that, I obviously, I had some choices and some people that I selected, you being one of them. But having said that, I mean, can you share a little bit about your own experience with mentoring, both as being sort of a mentor and a mentee?
Sure. One thing I'll say is that I think to be a mentor, you do get better with age, because one of the key factors is to kind of lose your own ego. And having been in the business as long as I have, I've had both my failures and successes, and that kind of rounds the corners and makes you a little more understanding of what other people are going through. At Newman Smith, where I was recently at, we had a very structured mentoring program like you talk about, Scott, and people were actually rotated as mentors so that young folks would get differing perspective on what to do. And that's good. I liken that more to training, though, than mentoring. And like a lot of other stuff, I kind of have my own personal views on the subject. I think mentoring should not be about training. Training is kind of a rote exercise that you will get through working on projects and interacting with peers. To me, mentoring is more about how can you help somebody achieve what they wish to achieve. And that may sound kind of innocuous, but the key issue I've run into is that many firms would like to train people, i.e., mentor them to preserve their connection to the firm and keep them there. I actually have a much different approach. I think a successful mentor should help the mentee be successful at what they wish to do. So, for example, if the mentee wanted to open a small firm at some point, I would encourage them to read some different stuff and talk to people about all the aspects of running a small firm. And, folks may leave to do that at some point. And a lot of time, firm principals get disappointed with that. But I look at life and careers as a circle. And I figure if you treat people well and help them with what they would like to do, eventually they'll come back. So that's probably my major message.
That's good advice. I think over the years, a couple others stand out to me. Like Ken Newman was one that gave me great advice over the years, and he became a pretty good friend and always gave me solid advice. Early on in my career, Dave Chaska, who I'm sure is somebody talking about finding a mentor. He always said, find somebody in the field of architecture that you kind of want to be like. And I thought that was kind of a good way to pursue it. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's true. I was mentored by a really great person, Ed Francis at William Kessler and Associates, who kind of guided me through my interests in preservation work within a firm that was decidedly a modernist high design firm, and also with a very specific expert, Henry Chambers, who was kind of a national guru in the area. And those two shepherded me through a number of experiences as a young architect, which I enjoyed. And Ed's kept on pushing me to achieve more over the years. And I finally have gotten a little tired and told him I'm trying to do what I can. Yeah, he's a great guy. And those memories are wonderful too, because you use those memories to impart your perspective on whoever you're talking to and mentoring. So that's all good.
No, agreed. I think, thinking back on your experiences with him, do you have some takeaways that you kind of stuck with you for a long time?
Well, he was a very talented guy on the one hand, and a very humble guy on the other, which is pretty unusual in this field, especially in terms of egos. You run into a lot of folks that are just very sure of themselves. And what was interesting to me about Ed is he was trained as a modernist architect, and when he designed a new building, that's how he approached it. But he kind of had this, what should I call it, second skill as a preservation architect that ended up being the majority of his career. And I was often fascinated by the fact that he didn't see that as his primary approach. I, on the other hand, when I got out of college, I was in a joint program with historic preservation and passive solar design, and I fully believed that I'd spend my career doing solar architecture. I did one house in 81, and then oil got cheap, and I spent the last 49 years working on historic preservation. So you never know what direction you're going to go in. And I suppose that's another issue, especially mentor to mentee. I can't give you advice on what the world's going to be like 5 years from now, much less 10. And certainly with all the changes with AI and other things, the definition of what we do as architects is going to evolve immensely. I kind of consider us a dinosaur profession because we still have people with master's degrees moving pucks around and making drawings instead of just thinking and conceiving of things. So the more a mentor can help someone sort of expand their interests and stay flexible, I think that's probably the greatest strength to impart to mentees.
No, I agree. Good words, Mike. I think, whenever I discuss sort of this subject of mentoring, whether it's our field or in another field, I always kind of state that we really become somewhat fragments of those who mentored us through the years. And, we somehow take on some of their opinions and personalities and hopefully all the good and none of the other stuff. But I mean, do you kind of see that with that sort of relationship?
Yeah, it's interesting going back to that first experience of mine. Although being mentored by Ed, I was influenced by Bill Kessler himself, and probably the biggest thing was his integrity about how he backed people. At one point in my early career, I was one of the young Turks that sort of opposed the establishment about demolishing the Hudson building in downtown Detroit. And relative to that, Bill got a call one day suggesting that I not do that anymore or that he fire me. And he came back and he said, you've been raising a lot of cane out there. What's the deal? I told him, and he said, well, go ahead. And he just brushed it off. And I thought, that takes a hugely big person to do that. And I always respected him for that. So that's an important thing too. I should also note sometimes varied education experience is also really important. I was very fortunate in school to be told about a professor in the engineering school who was a philosopher of technology. And the guy's name was Henryk Skalamovsky, and I had classes with him for 2 years, and he totally opened my mind to all kinds of stuff, how to challenge traditional thought and other things. So I suppose in a mentor, you want to seek people that open your eyes or challenge you to your view of the world, because that really helps in the long term.
Agreed. And I think we both agree the importance of mentoring, especially in today's world, whether it's architecture or not. In your heart and soul, Mike, why do you feel mentoring is important?
Well, we all need help. We all need a shoulder to lean on sometimes, and we also need to give back. I mean, all of us who have been mentored, unless we're really not self-conscious about it, realize that we go forth on the shoulders of others. So it's kind of human nature. The folks that have been in the trenches should be offering whatever insight or helping other folks work their way up. And I'm a strong believer in that. I advised high school students over the years, including times when I was in a presentation and someone asked how much money they'd make as an architect. And when I told them, they said, well, I can make more money than that working at McDonald's. And I said, well, if you're passionate about flipping burgers, do that. But if you're passionate about design or putting things together, then you'll succeed at this profession.
It's certainly good advice and painfully true at the same time. Given that, what do you feel like? What qualities, in your opinion, make a good mentor?
Well, as I said before, you need to have some humility about where you are in the world and try to leave your ego checked at the door. I think you have to be a really good listener, which is important everywhere, and try and help the person you're mentoring to realize their goals. To me, it's not about forming that person into something you want in your studio, but rather help them achieve whatever they feel is important. The other thing I've said over the years that's really important is if all young architects could get some training in running a small business or what it takes to do that, I think we'd all be better employees as a result, because I've often said people enter architecture school to avoid going into business. And I've spent a lot of my career trying to teach people that profit is not a bad word. It's not necessary to
Hmm.
keep things going. And I think people that are aware of what it takes to run a business also are a little bit more understanding of what a firm and others have to go through to just keep the lights on. So I don't know. I think I got off subject there, but
No, I think that's really good. I totally agree. I think over the years, I go back to LTU from time to time, and when I talk to professors and they ask me my opinion, that's one of the things I continue to tell them over many years is you need to integrate more business type classes or economics classes in the field, in the curriculum.
mhm.
Because I agree, it's, people are coming out of school, they have no idea about how a firm actually runs, aside from, the everyday practice of architecture.
I guess these are sort of funny, maybe not. I taught as an adjunct at LTU for a couple of years, and I remember one of my major gripes is when I was reviewing papers students submitted, I spent about 80% of my time correcting grammar and spelling errors versus looking at subject matter. And that's sort of a joke about architects, is that they can't spell, and a lot of them can't present themselves well. So I've often suggested people take public speaking classes or self improvement to be able to not only draw one's ideas, but be able to express them, because ultimately you have to sell what you do to others.
That's all good. I totally agree. And I think sometimes being mentored isn't sometimes a relationship. I know, thinking back over many years, I've worked with a lot of talented people, as I'm sure have you, mentors or otherwise, in my professional and personal development. As it pertains to that, sometimes just being there and listening to what's going on is some form of mentorship as well. Just, listening to conversations, whether it be phone conversations or, other conversations going around in the office. Have you seen that over your
Oh,
course?
definitely. And in fact, I, in general, have a whole problem or viewpoint about us working on computers, because back in the day when we had a sheet of paper on a drafting board and we were drawing on it, you could walk up to someone's desk and look over their shoulder, and you could pretty much get a good sense of where they were at with the work and even spot some obvious issues that had to be fixed. Ever since we started working on material inside of a machine, you can only see a small part of what's happening on the machine, and it forces you to get printouts to be able to look at stuff. And it's stifled a lot of the kind of serendipity of working in the studio. That being said, this whole issue that came out of the COVID situation with remote work, that I think is now part of our reality, I think is really tough, especially for young architects, young mentees, because everyone would like the comfort of just being able to get up in the mornings, stay in your pajamas, and go to work on your machine and have the freedom to have a little flexibility in your schedule. But in order to really get a good learning experience, it's just what you said. It's sitting in a studio, hearing other people discuss issues. Hopefully, somebody else has a problem that you can benefit from without having to go through it yourself. Although I found the best learning tool is to fail at stuff a lot, because every time you make a mistake, you learn from it and you're not going to do that one again. So, yeah, I absolutely think the face-to-face situation is important. We've tried to substitute this format like we're in today with Zoom or virtual meetings. And the tough part of this is that as human beings, we don't really get all the cues we need from seeing a two-dimensional image on a video screen in order to interact. And so it's a more stifled type of communication. And also I found that if you go through 4 or 5 of these type meetings in a day, it just really turns your mind into jello. So yeah, I think you need to be around other people.
Yeah, I think it is taxing, I think, for everybody to be on these, team meetings all day and, Zoom meetings or what you call it. But, you sort of tipped onto a big part of what I was going to ask you in this interview is, how do you see the future of mentoring being involved? Because mentoring is a one-on-one, it's a sort of a personal in-person thing, particularly now that AI is becoming a thing in our field and others, and remote working is not going away.
Well, I would just encourage people seeking out mentoring relationships to try and have them in a personal setting. If it means going out for coffee or whatever, if you can't do it at work per se, you really need that connection. And the other thing about mentoring, it's not all about the profession you're in. You need to kind of talk in a rounded manner about what is important in each of your lives. I know you're a musical guy, and I know that allows you to blow off some steam. And I used to be a musician many, many years ago, and I still pick up my horn once in a while and blow some air through it. So, and sing in a choir. And those things are good because they keep your mind fresh. And if you have other interests, one way I find a lot of peace is standing in a river, fly fishing, and it's really important to have other pursuits that take you away from what you do as your avocation, and give you that greater feel for life and for the earth and what have you. There, I'm waxing poetic. You better stop me.
No, that was genius. I really appreciate that. No, I think it's good, and I'll share with the listeners a lot of our talks. When I was kind of asking your advice on things, generally took place in a bar playing pool, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's many things you can solve over a pool game for sure.
That's right. That's right. So given we're in this kind of new place, as we were talking about with the, new technology and, some of the remote working, what can offices, organizations do to help foster that culture of mentoring?
Probably try and provide an environment that offers and promotes informal communication or touch base situations. I know at Newman Smith, the kitchen was always the center of our office. There was usually food on the counter, and people would go in there and sit for a few minutes and sometimes hold meetings in there. And that kind of a space or going out for a cup of coffee is important because it causes you to let your hair down a little bit and not be so disciplined about what you're dealing with. And that's when mentoring is really effective. If you can talk with somebody in a relaxed setting where you can absorb the information a little better. I think as in the pace of society today, we have a real difficult time listening and paying attention. And I think that's part of this whole situation with AI and social media and everything else is there's too much being thrown at us. We're connected to these smartphones at our hips. We can't get away from communication. And you do need to slow down and just be away from stuff when you're talking so that you kind of get to the heart of whatever issue the mentee or mentor may have.
Do you personally have any success stories or transformations that you've seen resulting from either being a mentee yourself or mentoring?
Well, I've had a few people over the years take my advice and end up going to another firm, which is probably not the best story about being a leader in a firm. But again, I find that others are impressed by it. And boy, when I left Newman Smith, we already had 4 or 5 people that had come back from when I started there 14 years before. So it's important. Certainly don't burn bridges, because in this profession, it's a small circle and you definitely will work with people again.
I totally agree. I think as much as our field is vast and broad, sometimes it really is kind of a small town, I always say. And,
Yep.
Architecture firms, you had mentioned music earlier. I always look at architecture firms as bands, and
Yeah.
people, leave to go play with another band, but a lot of times they come back to the original band. And that's kind of how Detroit has always worked, at least musically for me, as well as architecturally.
Well, you're aware in my family, my youngest son was a punk rock guitarist for years and then went into computer coding, and now he's managing a dozen people and making twice what I did. So he knows what's going on. But that brings up another issue that it only occurred to me recently why there's such a difference with these young folks in the computer fields. And that is that when we do architecture, even though we affect a lot of people in creating a building, I think they probably number in the thousands, possibly hundreds, thousands. When these folks are doing new programs and creating whatever they do in cyberspace, they potentially are affecting millions of people around the world. And it's really shortened the communication distance between an individual and folks from completely different cultures. And that's probably another important point to bring up about mentoring is when I did the retail work and we had people going all over the world, what I found was that the folks that grew up in an urban environment and kind of got kicked around a little bit and sort of dealt with the grit of a city were a lot easier when I sent them to Korea or Central America or whatever to do a job. Whereas the folks that kind of grew up in a protected suburban community had a little more difficulty because getting into those cultures. And today we have a huge mix of cultures. I mean, within our own communities, much less over the internet. And so the more that we can all help each other understand different viewpoints, different cultures, et cetera, is really important in today's work.
Agreed. And you mentioned specifically like younger people that are getting into really any field. What would you say to that young person that's maybe coming out of college that's probably should be seeking mentorship from somebody, but might be hesitant to do so? What advice would you tell them?
Well, this is probably counterintuitive for them, but I would say definitely contact somebody that you would like to talk to, and you will probably be surprised how open they are to talk. They may look formidable, and those of us with white hair, are kind of old, grizzled practitioners, but we remember when we were young, and we know a lot of the troubles and tribulations everyone goes through, and it may be a lot easier than you think is probably my biggest message. And I think a lot of the people I know want to help others. They want to give back because somebody helped them, and make the world a better place.
That's good advice. And as we start to kind of fade out this episode and knowing you for as long as I have, being a pretty humble guy, I get a chance to do something that I think doesn't take place probably as often as it should. And that I feel, those who have been mentors and help shape, sort of next generation and those leaders don't often get recognized. So I get the opportunity to thank you, Mike, for taking the opportunity for a lot of years to help give me great advice and help shape who I've become in the field over many years, despite me not always taking your advice. But, and I probably, looking back, I probably should have at a couple of points, but I just want to take the opportunity to also thank you for, help shaping me who I am.
Well, you mentioned when we first met, and I think you were off by over a decade or so. Because I remember talking to you when I was still at the retail firm in the 90s, and I think you were teaching CAD at Henry Ford Community College and some other things. And then, 3 or 4 times over the years, when we got together to play pool and just shoot the breeze, I tried to get you to come work with us. And for whatever reason, you were either on to your next thing or we didn't have enough work at the moment or whatever. And in a funny sort of way, I think that actually probably improved our mentoring connection over the years because it was always outside of a work environment. It was totally free of those constraints. So that brings up another point is it's probably good to try and find a mentor that you're not working with every day, probably not in the same firm or even the same market that you're in. I call myself a chameleon because I've been in 7 different offices, including 2 of my own that I had to fire myself from. So anyhow, that helps broaden the mentoring-mentee relationship as well.
I understand what you're saying, not being at the same workplace, because you over the course of many years, talked me off a lot of cliffs. And it probably was easier for you that we weren't at the same firm.
Yep. And thank you, by the way, for thanking me. I do appreciate that. I've enjoyed our dialogue over the years very much.
Well, thank you. And in closing, I always throw out this softball question to everybody.
Yes.
What are some of your favorite bands that you like to listen to?
Well, I'll go way back.
And that's good. I was expecting this.
Yeah, so, and I'll start with saying that my young punk rock son came home one day and said, "Dad, I think I'm into classical music." And I sat there for a minute and I was trying to figure out how to respond. And I said, "Well, like Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique?" He said, "No, Metallica." So that's classic rock. So that kind of put me in my place. But now I go back to the late 60s, early 70s, and the Animals with House of the Rising Sun and Jefferson Airplane, White Rabbit, and Jethro Tull, Aqualung, Moody Blues, Bob Dylan. Yeah, I don't know, Neil Young. So there's a bunch.
You basically name all the stuff that I learn and or listen to.
Yeah, I like the old crusty guys.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Well, again, Mike, I appreciate it. Any closing thoughts?
Well, to your point, to all that listen to this, I highly encourage you to kind of get over your fears and go ask somebody for a chance to talk to them about what you do and what you'd like to do. And hopefully that'll help round out your perspective on both the profession and life.
I can't thank Mike Kirk enough for assisting me with this episode. Now that I think back, we did in fact start to dialogue way back in 2002, and yikes, I was way off, which only means that Mike has been supporting me since then. Anyhow, I hope with this particular episode you gained a sense as to the importance of mentoring and why it can be critical to your ultimate success. This has been an important episode for me, as without getting advice along the way in my career, I'm not sure where I would be today. This episode afforded me a moment really of reflection and remembering specific lessons learned of those who had helped shape me and my decisions professionally. Therefore, I would like to pass on some of the things I've learned from those mentors that were generous with their time and lessons I learned from them in hopes it might possibly impact you or your career. First, Mike, and I think you can get a sense from this episode, Mike's kind demeanor and experience. Mike has always given me the best advice, as you heard, for many, many years. Like I say, I didn't always take his advice, but learned I probably should have, and that's, well, on me. And the two lessons I learned from Mike is always to be honest and give the best advice you can, even if it's not what the person wants to hear. Secondly, like Mike himself, be humble. I have found that being humble, especially in my field, really tends to surprisingly make you a standout. I think back to my brief stint at Gunnar Burkert's office when it had merged with a local engineering firm. I learned in part some design chops and, more importantly, design philosophy from Gunnar, mainly how he approached design holistically and conceptually. As I spoke earlier in this episode about the importance of just being in the office, much of what I learned from Gunnar came simply from being around him and listening. And yes, just listening. Dave Chasko, who helped shape a bit of what I learned surrounding the general practice of architecture, office dynamics, and moreover the business side of architecture. Dave also came from Gunnar Burkett's office as well, and went on to become department chair of LTU and now a professor at the Illinois School of Architecture. Through my college years, Dave was an example of the kind of architect I wanted to be once I left college. I state that as Dave was a great design talent, but moreover kept his rooted Midwest blue-collar personality, which I had always appreciated. And last but not least, I think back to Ken Newman, who became another friend and mentor of mine in the field. I had met Ken when I was a master's student, and he really liked my design work, and he actually introduced himself to me. We met and became friends for many years, and Ken always made himself available to meet with me at a moment's notice to discuss the field of architecture, life, or really anything. Later, Ken would recommend me and get me approved to attend Harvard for my graduate degree, which I actually did not pursue for other reasons, and we'll have to save that story for a different episode. Ken, in my opinion, was quite a design talent in his own right, and in my area started a successful practice which continues today, many years after his passing. Now, thinking back during our relationship with Ken, honestly, I have to say the most important thing that I learned from Ken and that he taught me was being a good architect never means sacrificing being a good person. Now, there are certainly many others along the way, and honestly, it could be a whole episode just thanking those people who helped shape my career. However, I would feel remiss if I didn't specifically thank those I just previously mentioned. Again, as always, I thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Where Do We Go From Here, and always tell your friends to listen, subscribe, and subscribe. Also, keep the mail and feedback coming. And one more action item for you out there, email me some show ideas. I would love to hear them. And now a little outro music. Since Mike started out with The Animals and also mentioned Bob Dylan, therefore it seemed appropriate to record a short version of House of the Rising Sun, made popular by The Animals, recorded in 1964, but also recorded earlier by Bob Dylan acoustically in 1961. Until next time.